Good morning, Excellencies, members of the European Parliament, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to violate the rules of good speaking and read this because I'd like to stay within time frame. We have a very tight schedule today, and I'll explain in a minute what the proceedings are so that everyone will take maximum advantage of this rare opportunity to exchange ideas with our very prestigious panel. My name is Gilbert Doctorow, and on behalf of the American Committee for East-West Accord, I welcome you to this roundtable discussion on defining a new security architecture for Europe that brings Russia in from the cold. This is only our second public event in Brussels, and so I feel obliged to explain that the committee has just completed its registration in the state of New York as a non-profit educational corporation. It has taken the name, this Committee for East-West Accord, and in doing so has accepted a legacy of a similarly named committee that went back to 1974 and lasted until 1992, and at the time in the United States was a leading platform for pro-détente movements, opinions in the United States. It closed its doors in 1994 in the belief that its raison d'etre had ceased by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the end of communism, and that we were going to have a very peaceful further development of Europe, united and without the kind of confrontations that had been typical of the Cold War. Well, we were all mistaken in that optimism. Current events over the past year have proven that we're in the midst of what many are calling a new Cold War. The need for calm, reflective, and substantive deliberations over international governance on pan-European and world levels is greater than ever. You've all received detailed information about our panelists. Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, a political scientist. Professor Emeritus Stephen Cohen of Princeton and New York Universities, an historian of Russia. And Katrina Vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, a magazine of commentary now celebrating its 150th anniversary. They will each make presentations lasting between 8 and 12 minutes. We have called this event a round table, and yet, as you see, we have a very traditional configuration of the dais and theater row seating. We did this because if we had genuinely put a round table here, we would have had significantly fewer places for you, and we wanted to have maximum audience. But to accommodate the concept of a round table, we have reserved the first 3 rows for people who otherwise would be seated around a round table. And they are allocated, the first 40 minutes are, as you see, taken up by our 3 presenters. The next 40 minutes will be allocated to those sitting in this section who have each 3 minutes to make their comments or their questions posed to our panelists, who in turn will have a minute to respond to questions such as they are. The last 40 minutes are open to the entire room for a Q&A. And I hope you will exercise that privilege and pose questions to a panel that is of rare quality and is ready to engage with you. And finally, I would like to inform you about our next planned event, which will be in the first half of May, and tentatively will be held in 2 cities, in Brussels and in Berlin. And the topic for that event will be Angela Merkel's Ostpolitik. Who supports it within Germany? How does it bear on the present East-West confrontation? And what does it mean for the evolution of the European Union? With those remarks, I now turn the microphone over to John Mearsheimer.
Thank Gilbert very much for inviting me here today and making all the logistical arrangements to get me across the Atlantic Ocean. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to hear me speak. The subject I've been asked to talk about is creating a new security architecture in Europe that brings the Russians out of the cold and promotes peace in the region. I think that the best we can hope for at this point in time is to return to the status quo ante. And by that, I mean the situation that existed here in Europe before 2008. I think there's no hope of creating a radically new architecture. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult to go back to the pre-2008 situation that existed here in Europe. I think the best way to understand the options that we face is to talk a little bit about the history of the past 25 years. And I think you want to divide that history up into two periods. The first period is from 1990 to 2008, and the second period is from 2008 up to the present. I think the period from 1990 to 2008 was really the golden period. Europe was remarkably peaceful, save for what happened in the Balkans, of course. But there was virtually no serious possibility of a conflict between Russia and the West at that point in time. And all seemed to be going very well here in Europe. And the question is, why was that the case? And there are two reasons. One, NATO remained intact, which meant the Americans remained committed to Europe, and the Americans basically served as the pacifier in the region. The United States was, in effect, the ultimate arbiter, a higher authority, a very powerful military presence in Europe that made it almost impossible for any of the states that fell underneath its umbrella to fight with each other. This is the principal reason that no European leader since the end of the Cold War has asked the Americans to leave. And it's the principal reasons the Russians were perfectly happy to allow the United States to remain in Western Europe after they retreated when the Cold War ended. So the American pacifier was an important part of the story. The second part of the story is that the West, and here we're talking mainly about NATO, did not threaten the Russians in any meaningful way. There's no question that the Russians were opposed to NATO expansion, and the first tranche in 1999, and even the second tranche in 2004 was opposed by the Russians, but the Russians did not view that as a mortal threat. So between 1990 and 2008, all was well in Europe. Again, because of one, the American pacifier, and two, there was no serious threat by the West against the Russians. But that all began to change in 2008. 2008 was a fateful year. First of all, in April of that year, you had the NATO summit in Bucharest. And at the end of that summit, NATO said in no uncertain terms that both Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. The Russians made it perfectly clear at the time that this was categorically unacceptable, and they made it clear that they would go to great lengths to prevent that from happening. Nevertheless, NATO did not back off. Furthermore, in May of that year, the European Union announced that there was going to be an Eastern Partnership, which in effect meant that the EU, too, would be moving eastward toward Ukraine. Not surprisingly, in August of 2008, you had a war between Georgia and Russia that came right out of the decision in April 2008 to include Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. The Georgians thought that NATO would back them if they got into a crisis or a conflict with the Russians. They, of course, were wrong, but nevertheless, that was the first big piece of evidence that trouble was in store. Barack Obama, as you know, got elected in November of 2008, and he came in with the goal in mind of resetting relations between Russia and the United States. He failed, and the reason he failed is because the West, with the Americans in the driver's seat, continued to push a policy that called for peeling Ukraine away from Russia's orbit and making it part of the West. EU expansion was one of the key strategies that underpinned that movement. NATO expansion was another strategy, and the third was democracy promotion. Democracy promotion in principle is a really attractive idea to all of us in the West, but the fact is that democracy promotion, when run by the United States, is really all about toppling leaders who are seen as anti-American or anti-West and putting in their place leaders who are pro-American or pro-West. And of course, the Orange Revolution was all about doing that. And toppling Yanukovych was all about doing that, putting in power a leader in Kiev who would be pro-West. So this triple-pronged strategy, NATO expansion, EU expansion, and democracy promotion, bothered the Russians greatly. And it all came to a head with the coup in Kiev on February 22nd, 2014, and we then had the major crisis that we now face. Now, what's the solution to this problem? I think the solution is to go back to the situation that existed before 2008. It's the only hope of settling this matter. What in particular has to be done is Ukraine has to be turned into a neutral buffer state. The West has to recognize the fact that there's no way that it can continue to pursue a set of policies that are designed to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. The Russians will not tolerate this, and instead what they will do is go to enormous lengths to wreck Ukraine. This is what's going on now. Putin is basically telling the West they have two choices. Either they back off, or he will go to great lengths to destroy Ukraine so that Ukraine cannot become part of the West. Well, if you want to end this crisis and you care greatly about the Ukrainian people and you don't want to see their country destroyed, then it's imperative that we back off and that we give up on the idea of making Ukraine part of the West and instead work to make it a neutral buffer state, which it was effectively between 1991 and 2014. I am talking here about returning to the status quo ante. This means, of course, that NATO expansion has to be explicitly taken off the table, and it means that EU expansion has to be explicitly taken off the table, and it means that the United States and the Europeans have to stop democracy promotion if that is designed to put in power people in Kiev who are pro-Western and anti-Russian. Now the question is, how likely is it that the West can do a 180-degree turn and abandon the present policies and adopt a policy that's designed to make Ukraine a neutral buffer state? I think it's very unlikely that this will happen. I think there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, Western leaders are so deeply invested in the present policy that it is going to be, I believe, very difficult for them to abandon these policies that have been at the heart of the West strategy since 2008, and instead adopt a policy designed to make Ukraine neutral. I think it's very hard to turn that ship around. Second, I think that Putin and the Russians more generally do not trust the West anymore, and any promises that we make will be hard to sell in Moscow. I think the waters have been so thoroughly poisoned in recent years that convincing the Russians that the West has goodwill and wants to work with them is going to be very difficult. Third, I think that NATO itself is in trouble, independent of this crisis. First of all, the United States is pivoting to Asia. And this means that if we pivot to some place, we have to pivot away from another place. And where we're going to pivot away from is Europe. China is a potential peer competitor, and all we need is a major crisis in Asia, and the United States will focus its attention on that region laser-like. And that means that America's interest in Europe will diminish significantly. I like to tell students that historically the United States has cared greatly about 3 areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere. 1, Europe, 2, Northeast Asia, and 3, the Persian Gulf. And over our entire history, Europe has been the most important area of the world for us outside the Western Hemisphere. We are undergoing, for the first time in our history, a fundamental transformation. Asia is going to become the most important area of the world for us. The Persian Gulf is going to become the 2nd most important area, and Europe is going to become a distant 3rd. So if China continues to rise, we're eventually going to pivot, and that means that we're going to greatly reduce our presence in Europe, and we're going to be much less interested in Europe than we have been over the course of our entire history. At the same time, if you look at what's happening among the European countries, they're not spending much money on defense, and it doesn't look like they're going to come together to take up the slack if the Americans pivot to Asia. And I think the principal bellwether of the trouble that lies ahead is what's happening in Britain. Defense spending is shrinking, and by the year 2019, all British troops will be removed from the European continent. This is an event of great significance. So what I'm saying to you is, even if we are able to turn around Western policy and convince Putin that the West has good intentions, the future of NATO, I think, is a lot of trouble on the horizon. And for all those reasons, I'm not sure you can go back to the status quo ante, which is the period before 2008. The bottom line here, we had an excellent situation with regard to security in Europe before 2008, and we, meaning the West, blew it big time. Thank you.
Without repeating Professor Mearsheimer, I will thank Gilbert Doctorow and all of you for coming. I can't do what I was asked to do, speak about a new security structure, because I am not smart enough, because I am a historian. Instead, I'm going to make some general historical points, because if you get the story wrong, you get the policy wrong. And I'll combine that briefly with a report from the American front line on the embattled handful of us, including Professor Mearsheimer and in exile, Gilbert Doctorow. Oh, that's a joke. He's not in exile, no. Struggling against this American policy and what's coming. I'll be very general, and you'll have to read between the lines. This is the worst international crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it is possibly a fateful turning point in history in 2 regards. No matter what you call it, we are in a new Cold War, and I could make an argument, won't do it now, that this Cold War, if it lasts, will be much more dangerous than the preceding Cold War, which we barely survived. The other turning point, I don't agree fully with Professor Mearsheimer about the way he formulated it, but I think this could be the beginning of the end of the so-called transatlantic alliance. That may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing, that's a different discussion. In the United States, and to a certain extent, alas, in Europe, all of this has been blamed on Russia, none of it on Western policy. Never heard a critical word about American policy except from 2 or 3 or 4 others in America. In particular, they call it Putin's aggression. That's a direct quote. It's all Putin's aggression. This means, in fundamental terms, that there is nothing to negotiate with Russia. Nothing. When you have a narrative that rules out any responsibility on your own part, what's to negotiate? Where's the compromise? They say that Putin may be like Hitler. If a man's like Hitler, you don't negotiate with him, you destroy him. And there is an element of seeking to destroy Putin in American policy. If it's true, it's not true, that Putin is destroying the post-Soviet or post-Cold War order in Europe, then he has to be destroyed. It's also not true, but this is the fundamental story. Where does this thinking lead? It leads to war with Russia, and I don't rule that out. For the first time in my long life, I began in this field in the 1960s, I think the possibility of war with Russia is real. I never thought that was the case with the Soviet Union, except by accident. That's how bad the situation is. The problem is this is a false historical narrative. It isn't true. It's also a false political analysis. And here I disagree fundamentally with Professor Mearsheimer, but we're like, though he's not Jewish, a big Jewish family. We live together, but we can have disagreements without going our separate ways. Unless you're a very big Jewish family, and then you break into factions and don't speak to each other. But in this case, I don't agree. This problem did not begin in November 2013 or in 2008. This problem began in the 1990s. When the Clinton administration adopted a winner-take-all policy toward post-Soviet Russia on the premise that the United States had won the Cold War and therefore Russia was roughly akin to Japan and Germany after World War II. They adopted a policy that was spearheaded by NATO expansion, but there was a lot more than that. They pursued a form of negotiation diplomacy called selective cooperation. If you deconstruct it, it means Russia gives, we take. And you will not be able to give me a single example of any major concession or reciprocal agreement, arms control aside, that the United States ever offered Russia in return for what it got since the 1990s. This policy was adopted by the Clinton administration, but it's pursued by every political party, every president, every American Congress, since President Clinton to President Obama. Among other things, this meant, and I focus your attention if you're really interested in security, because this is the core issue, this meant that the United States was entitled to a sphere or zone of influence as large as it wished, right up to Russia's borders, and Russia was entitled to no sphere of influence at all, not even in Georgia, the entryway to the Caucasus, or in Ukraine, with which Russia had been intermarried for centuries, literally. Russia had no right, and the American Vice President, Joseph Biden, specializes in making announcements that Russia is bad because it seeks a sphere of influence. Unlike America, which has expanded NATO, that is our sphere of influence, boundlessly for 20 years. This is the essential issue. It also meant that Russia, for 20 years, was excluded from the European security system that was created after the end of the Soviet Union. NATO expansion was the pivot of that security system, and it was directed in the direction of and against Russia. Russia was excluded. So talk of Russia destroying a security system to which it belonged is simply a fairy tale that we tell our children to make ourselves look virtuous. This did not happen. Now, what about Putin? Professor Sakwa, who is maybe the preeminent scholar of Putin's Russia in the West, can speak about this better than I can. He's here. You should read his two recent books. They're magnificent. Putin set out as a kind of pro-Western leader, following in the tradition of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but for somewhat different reasons. He attempted to join the United States in a partnership, and we saw this right after 9/11, when he called Bush and said, "I'm with you, what do you want?" He saved many American lives in the American ground war in Afghanistan to destroy or drive the Taliban from power. And in return, what Putin got was more expansion of NATO and the unilateral abolition of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, on which all Russian nuclear security was based. That gave us the crisis of missile defense today. Putin felt he was betrayed, and he paid a price in Russia because, yes, no, Putin is not an autocrat. He may be very authoritarian, he has all the power, he's ultimately the decider, but he's answerable to other power groups, and that made him look very bad. Rejected, Putin became, as I would put it, not anti-Western. I don't think he's anti-Western even today. As Khodorkovsky said, he's more European than 99% of other Russians. He is a kind of European man. But he became less pro-Western and particularly pro-American. Then came the Ukrainian crisis, and since, and this is my argument in America for which I am denounced as a Putin apologist, but historians will write this story as such. Since November 2013, Putin has been not aggressive, but reactive. At every stage, we can debate it, every month, every week, every day. he has been reactive. Now, we could say some of his reaction has been unwise, but we don't know the choices for sure he was presented. I think he took or reunified with Crimea too quickly. He should have waited, but that's just my opinion. He had the intelligence, I didn't. But he's been a reactive leader, and for this he's criticized in Moscow. I've heard him called in security circles an appeaser, soft on the West, not tough enough. And we hear that again today. Still worse, in this crisis, there is absolutely no effective opposition to American policy. This is profoundly unlike the case in the 1970s and 80s when I played some junior role in this very committee that Gil mentioned, in the struggle for what we then called détente. We had no effective political support, the handful of us, in the administration, in the State Department, in the Congress, in the political parties, in the think tanks, or on the campuses. We are utterly alone. This may be changing, but it's not clear. And this is an unprecedented situation in American politics. There is no discourse, no debate, no struggle between opposing points of view where decisions are made. This is exceedingly dangerous, and this is a failure of American democracy. Why it happened, I'm not sure. One reason why we've been marginalized and there's no opposition is this extraordinarily irrational and factual demonization of Putin, or vilification. I entered the field under Khrushchev. I don't remember a single Soviet communist leader ever being so personally vilified as Putin has. I just don't remember. Maybe I don't remember the Stalin era, but maybe under Stalin. But this is something new, and this too is hard to explain. We thought, some of us, when we got together and talked in 2014, that you would come to our rescue. You, I mean Europe. We knew England wouldn't. Sorry, Richard. You told me that, Richard, I think. So I knew that they wouldn't. But we thought that Europe being part of the same history as Russia, closer to Russia, economically embedded in Russia in a way that the United States would put an end to this craziness. But instead, most European countries in the EU, and certainly NATO, went along with Washington's policy, went along with the sanctions. You backed the regime that came to power in Kiev, that Washington immediately announced was fully democratic, constitutional, and legitimate. And so there was no real support we could find in Europe. Now things have begun to change. Europe is splitting on this. There are divisions among European states, within European states. That, of course, is the meaning of the Merkel-Hollande mission to Minsk II, from which the Americans were rightfully and purposely excluded. They were told, I'm not sure they were consulted. You could see the divisions in the press conference, joint press conference by Chancellor Merkel and President Obama. These were two different policies, two different leaders. One said there is no military solution. Our president said, I may send weapons. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in Europe. Every informed, sensible person surely knows, and Professor Mearsheimer ticked it off, what the solution is. It's been the solution for 20 years, and it's been the solution since November 2013. A federated, under whatever name, Ukraine. A Ukraine stable and whole, except for Crimea is not coming back. A Ukraine, and this is what the dispute began over, free to trade with Russia and with the West. Remember that even after a year of war, Russia remains Ukraine's #1 trading partner. #1 trading partner, by far. To whack off trade with Ukraine is just folly, and with Russia it's not going to happen. And of course, a permanent forever, no membership in NATO for Ukraine. The Western position that it's not on the agenda for tomorrow, the Russians see right through that. They've been told that before. This has to be in writing. No more oral promises as they gave to Gorbachev. It has to be, and it has to be ratified by the United Nations. Otherwise, there'll be no settlement. Is it too late? And I'll end on this. Is it too late? I don't know. Has too much blood been shed? In November 2013, only 20% of the people in Donbass wanted to separate from Ukraine. Now, we haven't had a recent poll, unless somebody knows it, but so many moms and dads, grandchildren and children have been killed The hatred for Kiev is so fierce in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. I'm not sure you will ever persuade these people to live with the Ukrainian state, though Putin wants them to, but he can't force them. And this is a big question in my mind. Can we still stop a prolonged new Cold War that will be more dangerous than the last one? Can the drift toward actual war be stopped? The drift toward war with Russia be stopped? I work and think as a historian. Excuse me. I wrote a biography, I think, about leaders. Here's what I think at the moment, based not on a lot of information, because I live in a provincial country far away. The four primary political capitals today, each is at a turning point, and here's how I see the situation. In Moscow, Putin, and thus Richard disagrees, 100% wants, and has wanted from the beginning, the solution for Ukraine that I just said. I don't agree with Professor Mearsheimer that Putin, the option of destroying Ukraine is an option for Putin. That will destabilize Russia forever. If only because there are 20 million or more intermarriages. I mean, he wants a stable Ukraine for Russia's security. He wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO, but I'm not sure that means destroying Ukraine. It's bad for Russia. But that's a discussion, I'm not sure. But Putin has his own politics in Russia. I won't mention the name Boris Nemtsov, but I just did. The impact this is going to have on Russian politics, we will see. In Washington, I voted for President Obama twice, for reasons having nothing to do with foreign policy. He is a weak foreign policy leader, or has been from the beginning, for various reasons. He is heavily influenced by the anti-Russian majority in his own Democratic Party, and he has taken an intense personal dislike to Putin. And I have never seen an American president make such personal remarks about a Russian leader in public. Taunting, childlike remarks almost. Clearly Putin's gotten under his skin. As in, about a month ago, Putin thought he was so hot a month ago, but look at him now, ha ha ha. That's not what the foreign policy leader of a major state should be doing. So I'm not optimistic, though he may bend now, or at least that seemed to be the case, to Minsk too. In Berlin and in the EU, there is Chancellor Merkel and Hollande. And I think Chancellor Merkel, Gil has his own understanding of her, I have very little, but the moment has come for her to decide how she wants to enter history. I think she probably now understands the situation as it is. That's why she raced to Kiev, she raced to Moscow, she raced to Washington, she raced back to Munich, she raced in. That's a lot of travel. She was in a kind of panic about what was going to happen. And then we have Kiev, and you're not allowed to say this in America, so I hope the reporters here won't report that I said it here. This is not a democratic regime in Kiev. The argument that we're fighting to save a democratic Ukraine today is a false statement. Very bad things are happening. And I'm not talking about in the east, I'm talking about in the part of Ukraine governed by Kiev. The ultranationalism of the Kiev regime, which grows by the day as President Poroshenko grows weaker and weaker, he's a diminishing president, means to me that the ultimate part of the solution is now in Kiev. Unless this regime changes its approach to Russia, or unless the West stops supporting Kiev unconditionally, I fear we are drifting toward war with Russia. So that is not, I guess, an optimistic conclusion. Thanks.
Good morning. I join Steve and John in thanking Gil. I'm honored to be here. I am no scholar. For 20 years, as Gil mentioned, I've edited The Nation, America's oldest weekly, founded in the immediate aftermath of our Civil War. The Nation has repeatedly championed ideas originally labeled as heretical, only to see them accepted as common sense a generation later. The Nation argued, for example, that finding a non-military solution in Vietnam was a better strategy than military intervention, and that was in 1954. We were at the forefront of opposing the Iraq War when many liberal interventionists supported that debacle. Above all, we believe it is vital to publish alternative views and drive them into our national debate and discussion. Steve has been writing for The Nation for over 30 years. His voice has been an important one in the United States. Important, I say, because these are, as you know, tough, rough times for those in the United States who challenge the orthodox conventional narrative on the Ukraine conflict. Indeed, I would submit that no modern precedent exists for the complicity of the American political media elite in this destructive policy toward Ukraine, Russia, and at this fateful turning point. Consider the considerable congressional and mainstream media debate, even protests were voiced during the run-up to the U.S. wars in Vietnam and Iraq, more recently proposed wars against Syria and Iran. Not today. A wise person once suggested approaching vexing problems with humility and with more questions than answers. And in that spirit, let me raise a few vexing questions in an attempt to offer, if not answers, thoughts which might provoke discussion. Why is it that since the 1990s, but especially today, U.S. progressives, and I will distinguish them from the liberal interventionists, both in the political class and in the media, have been complicit in supporting this policy toward Russia, even when a new Cold War will inevitably imperil progressive budgets, will increase a military defense budget, and will distract and take away resources needed from other missions. I would argue that since the Clinton-Bush era, triumphalism and the push for the spread of global liberalism supplanted the national interest as the true test of American foreign policy. I would submit that American foreign policy took a turn for the worse with 9/11 because it fused American triumphalism with American paranoia, creating an even stronger informal alliance between neocons and liberal interventionists. And it is striking, if you don't know, that the neocons and their narrative continue to write the script for U.S. foreign policy in many ways, considering if there was accountability in the U.S. system, they would be somewhere else than filling our TV sets and our op-ed pages. In terms of American domestic political dynamics, liberal interventionists hijacked the progressive agenda, except for the period from 2007 to 10 as opposition to the Iraq War hit its peak, by infusing this agenda with American triumphalism. And I would argue this was aided by two other developments. One was a generation change. When you look at Samantha Power at the UN or Susan Rice, who heads the National Security Council, remember the generation. Prior to the Balkans War, progressives had the Vietnam War, the nuclear arms race, wars in Central America as their main reference points. For this generation and subsequent generations, the ideology-defining reference points became the claims of genocide in Bosnia, Kosovo, and the real genocide in Rwanda. Fear. The nation was at the forefront also of countering, tackling the shameful McCarthyism that so afflicted America in the 50s, 60s, but I would argue that that McCarthyism is still in the DNA of America's political and media class. The fear that if you challenge the prevailing orthodoxy narrative, the groupthink, so to speak, lead the pack, you will have your patriotism, if not your sanity, questioned. You will be marginalized, vilified, controversialized. You will be called an apologist. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the progressive left has also failed to put forward a positive foreign policy. There have been protests, yes, against the Iraq War opposition, protests against illegal surveillance, but there hasn't been the fundamental rethink demanded in order to craft what I consider a new national security policy. Call it, if you will, and I hope Professor Mearsheimer won't flinch, a progressive realism, a common sense rethinking of the U.S.'s global strategy based on interests we have, threats we have, capacities we maintain, and an understanding that policing the world detracts from the real security of the United States. Because of this failure to rethink, U.S. progressives have become at best reactive and at worst absent from serious and meaningful foreign policy debates. Part of this is, of course, because there is a Democratic president in the White House. And that is always the case. It is tougher for progressives to articulate views on international events. But much of these problems comes from fundamentally also failure to challenge U.S. triumphalism when it comes to Russia. For example, NATO expansion. Yes, there was some progressive opposition, but most liberals signed on to the Clinton project, and it was a Clinton project, obviously worsened by Bush W. But the expansion of NATO and treating Russia under Yeltsin like a junior partner, and also diplomacy. The failure to understand what diplomacy means, which is in the bottom line compromise. It's not my way or your highway. And that has become a measure, I think, of a failure in the United States. The hijacking of progressivism by liberal internationalists has been assisted, and I was talking to Richard Sacco about this, by the absence of any credible national political spokespersons for progressive realism. The neocons have John McCain, who is the most frequent guest on the most popular Sunday talk show in America, and they have Lindsey Graham. Liberal interventionists have Hillary Clinton, who, as you must know, is considered the inevitable presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, and as many of you know, has very hawkish views on Ukraine and would bring into her administration people who have in these last weeks championed sending more weapons to Ukraine, people like Strobe Talbot. Fortunately, that has triggered a debate, and I would argue that, quote, there has been more sanity on that and a real pushback, even within Brookings, where Strobe Talbot resides. But progressive internationalists have lacked anyone of national stature to compete with them. For all their eloquence on inequality, on finance, on the rigged system that defines the American economic political system, Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, for example, has not had enough confidence, I might say with humility, expertise to speak on foreign policy questions. Though the Progressive Caucus, 80 people in the House of Representatives, which have been at the forefront of fighting for diplomacy with Iran, opposing more interventions in the Middle East. Steve and I have been in touch with some of their leaders, and in the last week, Representative Conyers from Michigan, Representative Ellison from Minnesota, and a few others have sent a letter to President Obama arguing, don't send weapons, find a political resolution, there are no military solutions. But I think that there's almost an indifference to Ukraine, Russia, because of the demands on all of these representatives. The ISIS factor, for example, you can see almost parallels with the fear that is quickly mobilized through social media and other factors, but there's much more attention to that than this very dangerous confrontation in Ukraine with the nuclear armed power in Russia. Let me close by saying, because I'm a member of the media, the nexus between the political class and the media is an important one. Does media coverage shape the political agenda, or vice versa? Probably both, or variously, depending on the subject. But the US media, by so unequivocally accepting the official US government EU version of events, blaming all on Russia, failing to provide history, nuance, let alone complexity, is now complicit in forming a false narrative that may lead the US toward war. The media malpractice, as Steve has written about in The Nation, is staggering. Most US pundits, most editorial pages, from conservative to liberal on Ukraine, on Russia, have bought into a fantasy version of events in which coup makers all wore white hats and the elected president, however corrupt, reviled, and Eastern Ukrainian citizens, along with Putin, all wore black hats. And a subset of that, I would say, and it's shameful, the humanitarian crisis in Eastern Ukraine until very recently was virtually ignored in the US media. Now, these one-sided media narratives have, with astonishingly few exceptions, gone unchallenged. We have this progressive cable network, you may have heard of it, called MSNBC. On some nights, it's, you might as well be watching Fox. They're lifting up voices which call for more war. There's also a factor which can't be discounted, which is a strong and residual anti-Russian Cold War sentiment, certainly among neocons, but also liberal hawks. And this infuses the mainstream media, the authoritative media, which defines what goes on inside the Beltway, or as I sometimes call it, the bubble, what defines the parameters of permissible debate. But this anti-Russian sentiment, and Steve talked about this, has been pumped up because Russia, for many, including progressives, has come to mean Putin. Where is the sense of a political landscape, political struggles in Russia? Where is the understanding that there are other players or limits on Putin's power? The demonization of Putin, and I can't believe I've been quoting Henry Kissinger these last months, but it's an alibi for a failure to have a policy, and that is what Henry Kissinger wrote last March. It is much tougher to have a real analytical understanding of what is happening. And for progressives, anti-Putin views, and many of you will understand this, have loomed large due to Russia's stance on social issues, LGBT issues. You saw that around Sochi, and in general, handling of Pussy Riot, handling of protests. Now, I support dissidents everywhere, free speech, right to protest, champion LGBT rights, but I also understand that people must fight their own battles, build their own movements to make real change, not the kind imposed in democracy promotion, which has been so discredited because it is imposed from the West, it is imposed from outside. So all understand, and this is what I'm trying to talk to people about in the United States now, because I think we are at a turning point. The decision, the debate about shipping weapons to Ukraine has triggered more attention. People are suddenly saying, what? And so there's an opening here. And that leads toward a discussion of a new Cold War. And here I come back to progressives understand, it's in their DNA, that Cold War closes off space for dissent, for budgets that will help people, that will build a more fair, humane country. And the danger of empowering war parties in all countries is something we're at terrible risk of. So in the determination to craft real security policy, at the Nation we are undertaking a project. I won't say will be like the campaign on the present danger, which the neocons launched decades ago, but we are going to try to craft this progressive realism and find allies, not just around Ukraine and Russia, but at the heart of it will be Ukraine and Russia, and continue to fight for a more pluralistic, democratic debate in our country, because the costs to American democracy are already clear from the ugliness and vilification of this debate in the United States. I will close with the mention of Boris Nemtsov. The rush to judgment in our media in these last days in the United States is an injustice and a disservice to those lives lost in Russia over these last years, to Boris Nemtsov. But we need to rethink very clearly the road forward. It is not a military road, as John and Steve have laid out. The contours of what is possible for a political solution are there, and to fight hard for it and to bring progressives back into an understanding of the dangers of Cold War. Thank you.